The candles flickered against my wine glass as Dad raised his own, that familiar sparkle in his eyes that meant he was about to make one of his speeches. To family, he began, his voice carrying across the dining room like it always did when he wanted everyone's attention. To having everyone together again. I forced a smile and lifted my glass, the Pinot Noir catching the light. Across from me, my stepmother Celeste beamed, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her champagne flute. My half-sister Bryn scrolled through her phone with one hand while mechanically stabbing at her salmon with the other. And beside me, my 15-year-old daughter Juniper sat unnaturally still, her dark hair falling like a curtain between us and the rest of the table. It's been too long since we've all been in the same room, Dad continued, and I caught the pointed look he shot my way. 3 years, to be exact. 3 years since I'd brought Juniper to one of these monthly family dinners at their pristine Westchester home. The house still smelled the same, expensive candles masking the underlying scent of fresh paint and new furniture. Everything was always new with Celeste. New curtains, new artwork, new Persian rugs that probably cost more than my annual rent. Even the family photos lining the hallway were in new frames, silver ones that reflected the light, just so. "We've missed you both so much," Celeste added, reaching across the table to squeeze my free hand. Her skin was soft, probably from those weekly spa treatments she posted about on Instagram. "Especially you, Juniper. You've grown so much since we last saw you." Juniper didn't respond. She hadn't said more than 3 words since we'd arrived an hour ago. Not when Dad had swept her into one of his bear hugs. Not when Celeste had gushed over how beautiful she looked. Not even when Bryn had made that passive-aggressive comment about her thrift store dress. I'd noticed the change in her the moment we'd walked through the front door. My usually animated daughter, the one who could talk for hours about her favorite books or the documentary she'd watched on marine biology, had gone completely quiet. Her shoulders were tense, her jaw clenched in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of myself at her age. "You're being rude, Juniper," Bryn said suddenly, not looking up from her phone. "Mom asked you a question." "Celeste isn't her mother," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Dad cleared his throat and set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "Let's not do this tonight, Marlo." But the damage was already done. I could feel the familiar tension creeping up my spine, the same feeling I'd gotten every time I'd sat at this table over the past 7 years. Ever since Dad had married Celeste when I was 26 and pregnant with Juniper. Ever since our little family of 2 had been absorbed into their picture-perfect world of charity galas and country club memberships. The thing about my father is that he's never been intentionally cruel. He's just absent when it matters. He was absent when Mom was dying of cancer my senior year of high school. Absent during my messy divorce from Juniper's father. Absent when I was working 3 jobs to keep us afloat while putting myself through graduate school. But he was always present for the big moments, the ones that looked good in Christmas cards. My college graduation, Juniper's baptism, the dinner parties where he could introduce his successful daughter, the marine biologist with her own research grant. "How's the research going?" he asked now, clearly trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. "Still studying those jellyfish?" "Comb jellies," I corrected automatically. "And yes, the bioluminescence study is going well." Celeste leaned forward with practiced interest. "It must be fascinating, working with such exotic creatures. Though I have to admit, I've always been terrified of jellyfish. Ever since that vacation in Cabo when Bryn got stung." "I was 8, Bryn muttered, finally looking up from her phone. "And dramatic about everything." "You were not dramatic," Celeste protested. "You were in genuine pain." I felt Juniper shift beside me, and when I glanced over, I saw her hand move slightly under the table. Something crinkled against my leg. Paper. I looked down as casually as I could and saw her fingers pressing a folded piece of notebook paper against my thigh. My heart skipped, but I kept my expression neutral as I palmed the note and slipped it into my lap. Juniper's face was still turned toward her barely touched plate, but I could see the tension in her neck, the way her free hand gripped her fork like a weapon. "The ocean has always fascinated me," Dad was saying. "Remember when you were little, Marlo? You used to collect shells on the beach and make up stories about the creatures that lived in them." I nodded absently, my fingers working to unfold the paper in my lap without drawing attention. The conversation flowed around me, something about vacation plans and Bryn's upcoming semester abroad, but the words seemed to come from underwater. When I finally managed to open the note, I had to read it twice before the words sank in. Call 911. They're drugging me. Please. The fork slipped from my fingers and clattered against my plate. Everyone looked at me, and I forced a laugh. Sorry, Butterfingers. But my hands were shaking now, and I pressed them flat against my napkin to hide it. I looked at Juniper, really looked at her, and saw what I'd been too distracted to notice before. The glassy quality to her eyes. The way she was blinking too slowly. The slight slur in her voice when she'd said fine to Dad's earlier question about school. Are you all right, sweetheart? Celeste asked, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawn together in concern. You look a little pale. Just tired, I managed. Long week at the lab. But my mind was racing. Drugging her? With what? When? I thought back to our arrival. Juniper had seemed fine in the car, chattering about the new book she was reading. But she'd gone quiet after Celeste had insisted she'd try the special lemonade she'd made just for her. The lemonade. The glass sitting untouched beside Juniper's plate, condensation rings marking the pristine tablecloth. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I need to use the bathroom. Of course, Dad said. You remember where it is? I nodded. But instead of heading toward the powder room off the main hallway, I ducked into the kitchen. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Emergency services. I need help, I whispered, pressing myself against the cool granite countertop. I'm at a family dinner, and I think my daughter is being drugged. She passed me a note saying to call 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. What's your location? I gave the address, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear Dad telling a story about his golf game, Celeste's tinkling laugh punctuating his words. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know, I admitted. My daughter seems disoriented, and she passed me a note asking for help. She's 15. We're at my father's house for dinner. Officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line? I have to go back, I said. They'll notice if I'm gone too long. I hung up and slipped my phone back into my purse, trying to compose myself. When I returned to the dining room, everyone was looking at me expectantly. Everything okay? Dad asked. Perfect, I lied, taking my seat. Juniper's eyes met mine briefly, and I saw a flicker of hope there that made my chest tight. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. I pushed food around my plate and made appropriate noises at the conversation, but every fiber of my being was focused on my daughter. She was getting worse, her eyelids drooping, her head occasionally swaying as if she was fighting to stay conscious. Juniper seems tired, I said carefully. Maybe we should head home soon. Nonsense, Celeste said quickly. The night is still young. Besides, I made her favorite dessert, chocolate lava cake. But it wasn't Juniper's favorite dessert. Her favorite was the key lime pie I made for her birthday every year, tart and sweet and nothing like the rich, heavy cake Celeste was describing. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden in the warm dining room air. Dad frowned and started to rise, but I was already on my feet. I'll get it, I said. 2 police officers stood on the front porch, their uniforms crisp under the porch light. The older one, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. Ma'am, we received a call from this address about a possible medical emergency. Yes, I said, my voice stronger now. My daughter. I think she's been drugged. They followed me back to the dining room, where the scene had shifted dramatically. Dad was standing now, his face flushed with confusion and anger. Celeste had gone pale, her hand pressed to her throat. Bryn had finally put down her phone and was staring at the officers with wide eyes. And Juniper was slumped in her chair, her eyes closed, barely responsive. What is the meaning of this? Dad demanded. Officers, there's clearly been some mistake. But the female officer was already kneeling beside Juniper, checking her pulse, lifting her eyelids. How long has she been like this? She was fine when we arrived, I said. But she's gotten progressively worse over the past hour. She passed me a note saying she was being drugged. That's ridiculous, Celeste said, but her voice was too high, too sharp. She's probably just tired. Teenagers, you know how they are. The male officer was looking at the glasses on the table, his gaze lingering on Juniper's untouched lemonade. Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask everyone to step away from the table. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The paramedics arrived and confirmed that Juniper had been drugged with a significant amount of benzodiazepine. The police searched the house and found a bottle of crushed Xanax hidden in Celeste's bathroom cabinet. Under questioning, Bryn broke first, sobbing as she admitted that her mother had been planning this for weeks. It turned out that Dadsel left everything to me and Juniper, with only a small trust for Celeste and Bryn. And Celeste, who'd grown accustomed to her lavish lifestyle, couldn't bear the thought of losing it when Dad eventually passed away. Her plan had been simple. Drug Juniper enough to make her seem unstable, then use that as grounds to petition for guardianship. With control over Juniper, she'd have control over the inheritance. Dad stood in his perfect foyer, his perfect world crumbling around him, and for the first time in my life, he looked old, fragile, human. I didn't know, he kept saying as they led Celeste away in handcuffs. Marlowe, you have to believe me. I had no idea. And the terrible thing was, I did believe him. He'd been absent for so much of my life, but he'd never been cruel. Never calculating. That was all Celeste. Juniper spent the night in the hospital for observation, but she recovered fully. The doctor said she'd been lucky, any more of the drug, and she might not have been able to write that note, might not have been conscious enough to ask for help. We never went back to the house in Westchester. Dad visits us now, in our small apartment that smells like salt water and old books. He sits at our second-hand kitchen table and drinks coffee from mismatched mugs, and sometimes I catch him looking at Juniper with something that might be pride. Celeste was sentenced to 8 years for attempted kidnapping and child endangerment. Bryn, who was 19 and legally an adult, got 3 years probation for her part in the scheme. She sends Juniper letters sometimes, apologies that my daughter reads and then throws away without comment. The strange thing is, I'm grateful for that dinner. Not for what happened to Juniper, never that, but for the way it forced us all to confront the truth. That family isn't about perfect houses, or expensive wine, or maintaining appearances. It's about showing up when it matters. It's about paying attention to the people you love, really seeing them, especially when they can't speak up for themselves. Juniper is 16 now, and she wants to study criminal justice. She says she wants to help other kids who can't advocate for themselves. Sometimes I catch her writing in the little notebook she carries everywhere, and I wonder if she's processing what happened that night, turning it into something meaningful. She still doesn't like lemonade.